Well, have you ever wanted to throw away your lawnmower? Blue Sky listener Keith sure has. He emailed us to say there are 40 million acres of boring, thirsty, invasive Kentucky bluegrass lawn in North America. It is a waste of millions of gallons of gas, millions of gallons of chemicals and fertilizers, and millions of gallons of fresh water. We ripped out our lawn and replaced it with native perennial flowers, fruit trees, herbs, and vegetables. There is virtually zero maintenance, no tilling, no chemicals, free fertilizer, and the biodiversity provides habitat and food for so many species of insects and birds. It's time for our lawnatic obsession with landscape to die. Some pretty strong words from Keith. So today, the show is for you, Keith, and everyone else who wants to ditch their lawnmowers. We'll be speaking with folks who have moved beyond grass to find creative alternatives to lawns. And we want to hear from you. Have you turned your lawn into something else? Are you growing food, or have you planted pollinators? Or maybe you have questions about how exactly to go about this. Our guest today can help you out. Give us a call, 1-800-716-2221, or email bluesky@cbc.ca. Well, our guest today describes herself as a longtime plantaholic, both inside and outside. She's a master gardener with a prairie horticultural certificate from the U of S. She spends the bulk of spring, summer, and fall putzing and planting in her 20-acre yard. And tomorrow night, Carmen Leibel will be leading a workshop through the Regina Horticultural Society all about creative alternatives to lawns. First, Carmen joins us here on Blue Sky. Carmen, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me. I look forward to the conversation.
Yeah, it's going to be great. Lots to learn here. So, when you look at a lawn, what do you think?
Well, I guess I look at it as a massive green that is somewhat pleasing to the eye, but has, as your person who had written in there, it is a burden in terms of energy, both physical and greenhouse gases, et cetera, to actually operate and manage a lawn. It's from, fertilizing it to cutting it to watering it and all the infrastructure that goes with it. And it's not useful. So there's all sorts of opportunities to do different things. And if you look back in the history of lawns, it really is about, medieval Europe. It was a status symbol, the rise of the auto aristocratic lawn, and it's been that symbol of uniformity and a reflection on societal values and whatnot. And there's so much more that it can be and should be in terms of using that land.
Yeah. So you're hosting this workshop that you're giving tomorrow night. Why do you want people to start thinking about alternatives to lawns?
Well, a lot of it is related to the cost of doing it as well as our time maintaining it. But there are all sorts of other values that go with doing something different instead of a lawn. Moving to a natural prairie landscape, what's ecologically historically here, adds all sorts of benefits in terms of biodiversity, food for pollinators, rebuilding the soil, that sort of thing. If you take it to a food garden, well, there's huge advantages to that in terms of growing your own food with the prices of food nowadays, and a higher degree of interest in having non-pesticide, herbicide food products or organic food products. There's definitely value in having something like that. Ground cover plants that are perhaps less maintenance, such as clover and whatnot, again, provide pollinator benefits, soil reconstruction, and that sort of thing.
There are so many different options if you are looking to move away from lawn. I mean, you just shared a few of them, and it would be a different approach, right? Having a natural prairie landscape is a different choice than having clover. And I've heard about xeriscaping, and then even I mean, some people are just choosing rocks, right? Like you see more and more in that because they don't want to have to mow their lawn. So, do you have a particular approach, or anything kind of goes? Does it matter what people are leaning towards if they are just trying to get away from a traditional grass lawn landscape?
Well, it kind of depends on a few things. One is where you are located. So if you're going to be doing native plants, you need to be considering if you're in northern Saskatchewan or southern Saskatchewan, what lives and thrives there is going to be very different for your climate, water conditions, etc. You also want to consider what time commitment you have to establishing what it is you're looking at doing. If you're going to be doing xeriscaping, or native plants or ground cover of some other sort or food gardens, you have to do preparation to that. So you'd be pulling out your lawn, you might be amending the soil, you might want to do, that's a lot of work to do that, to
Mhm.
pull it all out. So you want to consider that. You want to consider how much your budget is. If you want to start xeriscaping a small yard, that's one thing. But if you want to start doing a larger yard that has perhaps hardscaping, pavement or pavers, and you're going to do pots and whatnot around, that's also a very different aspect of what it's going to take to do it. Depending on your ground covers that you, if you wanted to, for example, rip out your lawn, put in creeping thyme, beautiful, you can walk on it, doesn't require cutting, mowing, that kind of thing, but it takes a heck of a long time to establish it. So that's a consideration. You could also put in a bunch of junipers, low-lying junipers, but those again take a long time to establish. And when they're done their time zone or done their time period of about 15 to 20 years, you got to think about ripping them out. So it's looking at what's your budget, how much time do you have to spend on this, and what you want to serve. Is it pollinators? Is it water management? Is it growing food?
Hmm. And people can start small, right? Like I think even like my parents have a much larger lawn than I do. They live in a more sort of 80s style suburban home. And so they've got quite a large lawn, whereas I'm in a more narrow lot. And so I've wondered, like, if you've got quite a bit, can you pick a patch and try something different? And then I want to ask you how you'd actually go about doing that, because thinking about digging out your lawn can feel like a whole lot of work.
Oh, yes. You definitely, I would recommend that you start in stages or smaller chunks. And, if you think about your particular yard, you might have a walkway going up the center. Maybe you just start with the patch underneath the front left side of your entranceway and do some trial and error kinds of things. What's going to grow in that particular location, and just start small. The other thing to consider is that if you were to do everything all at once, you likely have a huge weed management challenge ahead of you in terms of, geez, you've ripped out all the lawn, you didn't get to it like you thought you were going to, and now you've got to contend with this bundle of weeds, and then the neighbors get a little upset with you.
Yeah, so how so start small so you don't end up in that situation? Is that just the best advice? Don't take on too much?
Yeah, yeah. There is, if you ever are in that situation where you just didn't get around to doing it, think about putting down mulch to manage the weed situation for the interim.
I want to bring somebody else into the conversation because like I said, there are several ways to do this, and the next person we're going to talk to knows a lot about pollinators. So, you may have heard of No Mow May before, but our guest today takes that a step further and encourages people to grow pollinators in their yards. Sarah Ludlow has started this process on her own lawn, and she's on the line now to tell us how that's going. Sarah, welcome to Blue Sky. Hello, Sarah. You might be on mute, Sarah. I can ask Carmen another question while you get sorted. But let's see, Sarah, are you with us? Okay, you know what? I'll go back to Carmen for a second. Because Carmen, there are purists out there who are now really encouraging, native plants, right? But and so clover wouldn't be in that category. What's your take on things? Should people be gravitating towards species that are sort of from this place, or is anything better than lawn?
I would look at it as anything is better than lawn. Clover, yes, it's not the purest side of things, but it does add value in terms of pollinator and ground cover and that kind of thing. The other thing to consider is some of the native plants are more difficult to source than you might like. Clover, you can probably get a little easier, but there are some great online places that do offer native seed, but it it is more challenging to access them. Find the ones that are most suitable for you, and then being able to actually have them thrive. It's a little bit time consuming sometimes.
Yeah, and I have seen some posts circulating online from some reliable sources. I can't remember who started it, but urging some caution when buying some seeds um at the store, right? To be careful not to be introducing invasive species into your yard. Is that something that you're cautious of, and do you help people with some tips on how to avoid things that maybe we shouldn't be planting?
Absolutely never buy that generic label, or not label, but it's bundled as wildflowers.
Yeah.
Odds are you are going to have some sort of invasive species coming in there. Baby's breath is a perfect one. A lot of those wildflower packets will include baby's breath, which is actually considered a noxious weed in Alberta. I don't think Saskatchewan has done that yet, but so just be very careful. Do your homework in terms of your sources.
And are there other ways to do this without having to dig up lawn? I ask you this because I have a bit of experience with this. I am part of a community group that has converted a large grassy boulevard in our neighborhood into a native plant garden, and we've added vegetables, and we've gotten rid of almost all of the non-native grass. And so our first year we dug out a bunch of the grass and planted some seedlings that we got from a nursery that was growing native plants. Then, as the years went on, we're like, maybe we should try a different approach. That's a lot of work. So we laid out some newspaper, layered it with soil, mulch, and kind of built up soil that way. So are there different ways of getting rid of lawn like that?
What I have done is I typically I'll enlarge my beds that I have out here, and I will use an edger, and I will flip. I will cut out little pieces of sod, and I flip them over upside down, let them dry out, and basically that kind of decomposes, and I don't lose the topsoil. I just and it the grass basically dies out. You're showing the roots to the air. You're hiding the green that sucks, or that allows it to grow, and then you're repurposing, you're reusing that soil without losing it. It's kind of mulching itself, is
Hmm.
what I would call it.
Okay. Well, I think we have Sarah on the line now, and I'm curious to know how she's gone about this. Sarah, hello.
Hello.
Nice to hear your
Can you hear me
voice.
now?
Yes,
Okay,
we can
excellent.
hear
Yes,
you. It
sorry.
is great to have you. So, what is a bit of your story? What first got you thinking about turning your lawn into something other than just grass?
Well, lawns are essentially food deserts for pollinators and wildlife. There's very few species that use um, our, introduced species of grasses that we use as lawns as habitat. So, just trying to, make a bit more food and shelter available for them.
So, how did you do this? What kind of plants did you put in?
So I started in a small corner because, as has been pointed out, it's a lot of work to do the whole thing all at once. And we started off with a mix of native and non-native flower species, making sure none of them are invasive. And that's just due to the availability of the native plants. I would do 100% native if I could, but they're a little bit harder to source. So I went the route of having more flowers now, and then I plan to grow that using native species as I go on.
Mm-hmm. And where are you at now? Like, what kind of maintenance is involved with your yard now?
Totally. So I have mulched around the plants that we planted to help reduce the weeds. Um, and then, there are the odd ones that do come up, so weeding those, and then just watering to make sure the plants that we've planted get established and grow.
And maybe share with people some of what you have planted. Like, what species were you able to get? What would we see if we came to your yard?
I have some three-flowered avens, which is a native prairie plant. I also have some laetris, which is a purple flower, as well as some upright prairie cone flower. So those are the main native ones. And then I also have, oh no, I do have a native grass as well
Hmm.
um, in my in my little flower bed because um, Yeah, a little variety.
Nice. I know that
Yeah,
a lot of people in Saskatoon will connect with Wild about YXC, and we have a couple of hookups through them to help us get some of our plants for our boulevard garden. But where do you source yours?
that's a very good question. So a lot of often you need to start them yourselves because the local just sort of big box or general garden centers aren't selling a lot of native plants. So there's some really good local seed suppliers. So Blazing Star Wildflowers, based out of Aberdeen, Saskatchewan, is a really good source. Prairie Originals is another one. So you'd start your own seeds and then plant out your little seedlings once they're big enough to survive. And if you do go through, I think it's Calgary or Winnipeg, there are places there that you can buy actual little seedlings
Mm-hmm.
of native plants. And I think, Blazing Star will bring seedlings of various different species to the farmers markets in Saskatoon sometimes. So if you follow them on social media, you could probably catch when that happens.
And what have you noticed since you made this change? I'm wondering about the birds, the bees, the insects that you've seen.
Totally, yeah. So I do get lots of bees and butterflies, and everything is connected. So if you have lots of insects, you're going to get more birds, and it's sort of a trickle down effect. So I do have lots of birds around as well.
Do you have any idea if any of these native plants could thrive in on a balcony? You know, I know they can definitely do well in an urban backyard, right? But for somebody who maybe has a smaller space, are they able to incorporate these into like onto a balcony?
Yeah, I think so. I think you could plant. I think there's some species would do better than others, but I definitely think you could plant them in a pot or a container on your balcony, and you would still, have the flowers or have those plants and getting that benefit to wildlife.
Carmen, do you have thoughts on that? People with either small yards or maybe they're in an apartment and they'd like to support pollinators. Are they able to do this on a balcony?
I think as what Sarah suggests, you can. I guess it becomes a lot of the native plants. They do thrive as a result of the cold period that we have, and my experience in over trying to overwinter some plants in a pot is challenging because it doesn't. It's not. You've got the cold that goes around the pot that might they're not getting the full insulation value of being in the ground. So sometimes what you can do is actually find some place to pop that pot, dig a hole in the ground itself, pop that pot in there and overwinter it in that capacity.
I want to ask you both about people's perceptions of these sorts of things. I mean, there's multiple sides to this. Like some people just really like their lawns and they want that nice manicured look. So you know, you've got folks who really take pride in having that nice looking lawn. People who maybe are willing to make the change might be worried about what their neighbors think of them taking a more natural approach to their yard. So, what advice might you have for someone who wants to do this, but they're not sure if it's totally acceptable on their block? Sarah, do you want to start?
Sure. I would say like you could talk to your neighbors and tell them why you're doing what you're doing, and you can also do it in a way that is not a total mess. I guess like it can still be tidy and I don't know, organized looking with native plants without being a lawn kind of thing. It doesn't have to be just a wild jungle. So I think how you go about it, and definitely if you talk to them, maybe they would be interested in like joining your efforts. So yeah, that's what I would suggest.
Carmen, what would you say to someone who's maybe a bit worried about going more natural?
I think it's communicating and educating, as Sarah suggests, and even something like having a little sign,
Mm.
that you make at the bottom and saying, "I'm doing this for the bees. I'm doing this for the birds," and you make it into a you're helping. The other thing is, this was many years ago. My granddad, he actually ripped up his front lawn and planted it to potatoes, and this would have been in like the 70s. And the gasps in the neighborhood was like, what the heck is going on? But you know what? He shared his potatoes with the neighbors, and lo and behold, all was good, right? Unfortunately, when that
Mhm.
house sold years down the road, it went right back to lawn.
But you know, you're right. If you can share the potatoes, then more people can get on board. That is That is 100% true. It's been lovely talking to both of you. I know you've got this talk, and so really appreciate you taking some time to speak with us today. So, Carmen, thank you.
Thanks for having me. Have a great rest of your day.
You too. Today on the show, we're talking about what else you could do in your yard other than having a large lawn. And we just heard some examples there about adding some native plants to your yard. Well, the second part of our show is focusing on turning lawns into places where food is growing. But before we introduce you to our next guests, I do want to remind you that you can share with us too. We talked about trees the other day on this show, and people called and talked about what they had in their yards, and it was fantastic. So hoping for more of that today. We'd love to hear about how you're getting creative in your yard and what you've done instead of lawn. So give us a shout, 1-800-716-2221. You can also email us at bluesky@cbc.ca. So we do have some great guests to share their experience and answer any questions you might have. Sandra Walker is a member of Wild About Saskatoon. She's an experienced native plant gardener, an ethnobotanist, and the author of The Path to Wild Food. She is joining us from here in Saskatoon. Sandra, welcome to Blue Sky.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's good to be with you. And then joining us from our Regina studio is Candace Benson. She is one half of City Street Farms, a duo that transforms front and backyards in Regina into productive vegetable and flower gardens. Candace, welcome to Blue Sky.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Candace, I want to start with you. For people who haven't heard of your City Street Farms, where did this idea come from?
Sure. So it's myself and my business partner, Miranda Holt. And so the two of us started City Street Farms in the kind of fall, winter of 2020, and 2021 was our first season. Basically, we'd both taken permaculture classes in the years previous and had a really productive brainstorming session, and from that, City Street Farms was born. Just out of this same idea of wanting to do something different with lawns, seeing all this land around the city, and realizing that it was a pretty tangible idea to be able to use that lawn for something other than producing grass and using it to produce food.
I want to know all about this. And I have to admit, I'm pretty sure you had a little stall at the farmer's market either last year or the year before, and I beelined it right to you guys because I was so curious about how you were making this work. So how many yards are you doing now?
So we have 6, mostly front yards, a couple backyards as well. And then Miranda and I each have a backyard of our own. So we have about 8 spaces in total. Our first year we started with 5. So to Carmen's point earlier, it's a lot of work to transform 1 yard, let alone 5. And then we added a couple more in our second year, and we've actually let 1 go just for location. But now we're at 6 plus, 1 to 2 of our own spaces.
So how have you actually done it? So you get people who are like, hey, I've got this space, do something with it. So what do you do?
Yeah, exactly. So we were pleasantly surprised with the kind of the response from people in Regina. Everyone was really on board with this idea. We thought we'd have to convince people a little bit more, but that really wasn't the problem. There's a big appetite to do something different with people's lawns, and they maybe just don't have the knowledge or the time to be able to do that. So finding the yards was not the issue. Basically, we partner with the homeowner. They provide the space and they pay their water bill, and then we do all of the work. So we have full kind of responsibility and we take care of the garden fully. Homeowners can pitch in if they want to, but that's we do all the work there. And then the homeowner gets vegetables and flowers throughout the season kind of as our rent for the space, and we do all the work, and then we sell the produce and bouquets at the Regina Farmers Market, like you mentioned, and then we also do a weekly subscription for the bouquets and the veggies.
And how are you actually growing stuff in these yards? I'm just curious about that side of it. Are you using garden boxes? Did you dig up their lawn? Like what do these spaces look like now?
Right, so we used a sod cutter. Just because we were doing it in a very short time frame, we needed something that was quick. So we used a sod cutter, which was a pretty simple tool. It's kind of like a rototiller, but instead of tilling, it just has a blade that cuts the first 1 to 2 inches of the sod. And we did a similar method to what Carmen mentioned. We just flipped the sod onto itself so that we didn't have to transport the sod and, take a whole bunch of stuff to the landfill. And it just decomposed, and that formed our pathways. And then we brought in topsoil and compost in that first year. So we did in-ground beds. You could definitely do raised beds if you wanted to. We have a couple at one of our yards that the homeowner wanted to put in anyway, but most of them are in-ground beds. And then we usually have a 3-foot bed with a 1-foot walking path in the middle, and we'll aim to use as much of the lawn as we can, going around tree roots and stuff, but we'll use as much of the space as we can so that we don't have grass creeping in, and that we can, make the most of the space.
How do the homeowners react? How do the neighbors react?
They run the gamut, to be honest. The neighbors have been great. We haven't really had any issues. We try to keep, that line pretty tidy. And then in terms of the homeowners, some of them are more active gardeners, and so they have gardens of their own in the rest of their yard, and they're a little bit more interested and active in what we're doing. And some are quite passive, younger, newer homeowners that have a lot to do maybe in their backyard, and they just didn't even want to think about the front yard, so they're quite passive. And both work out great for us.
So part of the reason why you wanted to do this is so that you would have an opportunity to sell what you were growing, right? Like that's the difference between having a community garden plot and actually taking over some private property and growing, right? That gives you the ability to be able to sell what you're growing?
Yeah, exactly. So there is I guess it's a bylaw probably that anything grown in a community garden you can't sell. But yeah, if it's grown on your private residents, you can. And I don't know about the rest of the province, but definitely in Regina, there's a pretty long waiting list to get into community gardens. So even if you wanted to do this yourself in your own yard, you may have to wait a few years to get a plot at a community garden. So it's also just, an example of using space that's already there and not being used.
Is this sustainable for you? I'm curious if the money you make from all of this, it's so much work. So is this working out?
It is working out. I was saying to Nicole earlier, you can make a living doing it for sure. There's models in other places in Canada that have a bit of a longer growing season or maybe invest in greenhouses in order to make the work pay off a little bit more in the edge season. And I will say, if you're a bit more choosy with the crops you grow, you could definitely make a living at it. Miranda and I have chosen to kind of keep it a smaller farm where we get to experiment a little bit more and learn a little bit more about different growing methods. And so it's not our top priority. So we don't make a living doing this. We do okay. But there's definitely that option. So you could focus on lettuce, greens, crops that you can succession 2 or 3 times in a season. Bouquets and fresh cut flowers are definitely a great thing for that. So there's a way to do it for sure.
Do you think this could be a way for more people to get into agriculture?
Yes, definitely with land prices in Saskatchewan and across Canada, it's pretty prohibitive for a new farmer who maybe doesn't have family ties to land to be able to start. And it's a lot to learn. So like we were talking about earlier in the show, starting small, this is a great way to do it. There's really little or low capital investment that you need to start a farm like this. You could have your own yard, use your neighbor's yard, and go from there. So it's a great way to learn without having to invest too much in something that maybe you don't end up liking that much.
Okay, don't go anywhere, Candace. We've got a few more questions, and we want to introduce people to Sandra and have her talk about her yard. But I want to share a couple emails here and just remind folks that you can tell us about your yards, 1-800-716-2221, or email bluesky@cbc.ca. Kevin in Regina writes, I'm totally on board with the movement to get rid of grass. I have been adding more and more gardening space in my front yard for several years now, and I've noticed more and more houses around my neighborhood doing similar things. I use my front yard gardening space mainly for growing vegetables. Well, let's go to Sandra Walker now, who is a member of Wild About Saskatoon and the author of Path to Wild Food. Sandra, I'm curious about your yard. Tell us about it. If we went to your place, what would we see, Sandra?
Well, to start off with, I live in an old neighborhood, so when you first enter my front yard, it is very shady because we have nice big trees. So what I have in the front yard is stuff that you would find in the woods or along riparian areas. Native prairie and those kind of areas are one of the most vanishing ecosystems on the planet. And so anything that we can do to help that biodiversity. And I've had some really amazing things in my yard, I have to admit. So what I have is like sarsaparilla, wintergreen, bedstraw, uh, anemone, and that's the boulevard. And I have to admit, I started small too, and the grass in the boulevard was never growing. And so when I turned it into the native stuff, it's this nice green area now. And
Mhm.
I get a lot of rabbits. That's what it's partly for too, to feed the rabbits. And then when you come into the actual property, the woman who originally owned my house was quite the gardener. So I moved to her. We ripped up our front lawn, and how we started was we planted potatoes that first year and just conditioned the soil with potatoes, and then you're really getting rid of a lot of grass that way too, because the next year you're pulling it up again, right, digging it up.
And it makes
And
for
so
really healthy
starting
soil,
with
right? Like
potatoes,
people often say plant potatoes and you'll then the following
yeah.
year you'll be good.
Yeah, and we did that with the city boulevard, not anticipating anything to be productive in there, but we got nice little small potatoes and they were great. So I can't complain. And so then my backyard's actually very sunny. And so I have what you see on the top, native prairie. And as an ethnobotanist, I really like wild foods. And so and because I became an ethnobotanist, because First Nations foods got wiped off the map. You go to other cultures, they celebrate those foods, part of food sovereignty in many respects. Well, so I have wild onions in the backyard, which are absolutely delicious in a cheese sauce on an asparagus omelet. And then I have Indian breadroot, which is what grows on it. It's a member of the lupin family, and what grows on it is a tuber. And that tuber can be used like a potato or dried out and ground into flour. And it's a potato, a starch that does not convert to sugar, so it's really good for people with diabetes. Now, it takes a long time for that plant to look really, really nice, I have to admit, but it is a gorgeous plant. Um, you
People
name it, I have it. I have several different types of milkweed, from showy to world to dwarf milkweed. And what was really interesting last year is I've had the monarch butterflies come twice. We've been on our property for over 20 years. And they came to the showy milkweed and the dwarf milkweed. And the ones on the showy milkweed got fatter faster than the ones on the dwarf milkweed. That was kind of
That just gives me goosebumps. That's amazing. Some people listening though, Sandra, might feel a little bit intimidated. These are plants they're not familiar with. They're not ethnobotanists. Um, like it can be. It's a lot to try and figure out. So, what would you say to someone who feels a bit intimidated by this?
start small, definitely. I mean, like I said, we've been on this property for 20 years, so we always started small, and you just start expanding, and the more, because it's gorgeous, it really is. Native prairie is one of, I think, beautiful, and it is one of the most productive ecosystems, which is why First Nations never farmed here in the first place. And being a member of Wild About Saskatoon and Pollinators Paradise, we've encouraged several other people within the city, and my neighborhood actually has one of the most Pollinators Paradise signs. And that, I think that sign really helps. It does, because I've never had to explain to my neighbors, but they also know what I do for a living. So
Okay, well, I'm in your neighborhood, and I'm part of that boulevard. I think just down the way from you, and you led a tour to our boulevard garden because you
oh,
guys did those walking tours recently, and so I was a big part of that. Now, I come to that garden without a lot of plant knowledge. I bring the lemonade and the fun. I like to build community, but I've learned so much from people in our neighborhood. And when you start to tap people on the shoulder and ask for a bit of help and like, hey, do you know about this? And what could we add here? It's pretty remarkable how there seems to be this growing community in Saskatoon that is interested in this, don't you think?
yes, yes. And like I said, that our neighborhood has the most, and it's been encouraging more people to convert their yards. Actually, my neighbor came to me and asked about her front boulevard, and would I help her? And we often, we're at the farmers market as well, and we give away seeds every now and then. We have a thing coming up on June 9th in Bona Vista Schoolyard, and Prairie Boutiques will be there, and so will Blazing Star, and we'll be there as well with seeds to give out to people, because the more we can encourage people to have. I actually had a maple moth in my yard. It's this beautiful little pink maple moth. I've had the hummingbird hawk moth in my yard. And the birds are I have a pond. I have two ponds too, and that helps bring in wildlife as well, I have to admit.
So lovely. I want to share with you an email that we got from Keith. So Keith's the one who's kind of got us thinking about this as a show. He was the person at the very start that I talked about who was like, get rid of your lawn. So he writes, thanks for the show. Here's a list of some of our plantings: bee balm, lupins, columbine, milkweed, sunflowers, fireweed, not a weed, Saskatoon berries, hascat berries, gooseberries, elderberries, raspberries, wild strawberries, and choke cherries. Sandra, what do you think of that?
That sounds great, because a lot of my ground cover is wild strawberries in the boulevard and stuff, and so yeah, no, that's perfect, because you can have other things pop up through those strawberries, like the sarsaparilla, and I have the wintergreen kind of competes a little bit with the strawberries, I have to admit, but you just need to give them their little space, each species, and it's interesting to watch them grow, and how they compete with one another once things get established.
How do you talk to people, Sandra, who may feel quite attached to their lawns? I asked that to our first two guests, and like even though I just I find so much joy in all of this, and I love seeing the conversion, going from lawn to a full garden is just like it's incredible. But at the same time, people take a lot of pride in their yards, and I always want to be open, and I don't want to be judgmental. So how do you engage with people who might still feel very attached to their lawns?
I've never had anyone complain to me when I'm out there watering it, that I've always said, "Oh, they say they like what I've done to it." But those who do have grass, I mean, to each their own sort of thing. But grass is an invasive species in many respects. And again, pointing out that the biodiversity that you get if you have these different plants in your, and yeah, grass takes a lot to consume with the fertilizing and those kind of things. It's just good for you for having nice grass, but there's alternatives, and I think people just need to be open to it. And one of the things that's been happening in the United States is they have started giving people property tax breaks for those who are planting native, because we don't consume as much water, and things get looked at. It's helping the biodiversity as well. So that's my big line with it, is that that the biodiversity is needed. And
It also makes me think of water restrictions. The mayor of Calgary several weeks ago now was talking, warning people like, hey, we may be in for some serious water restrictions. And so that will have an impact on your lawn if you are limited with how much you can water. Candace, I'm interested if you have any thoughts on this. If you have thoughts on tax breaks in the States and just, ways that a city could incentivize this sort of thing. Candace?
Am I on there now? Okay.
You are now, yes.
Yeah, I've heard about that property tax break. And yeah, I think it is a great idea because if you're, like Sandra mentioned, if you're planting things that are meant to grow here, and if you're watering a little bit more efficiently, you're definitely using less water, and you're putting your resources into something that is more productive. And I also think, grass has its place. People use their backyards for a lot of things, but there tends to be a lot of grass that's tended to but not really used. So it's, how can we find that balance between the two so we can, grow food and grow pollinator habitat and also have places to play. I think there's room for both of those.
Well, yeah, and I'm wondering if either of you have thoughts on other types of ground cover. So Sandra, I want to put that question to you actually. Do you have thoughts on things like clover or other things that people might choose that are kind of like grass but aren't grass?
well, that's what I did with the city boulevard too, is I actually have clover in there just for a large ground cover. And as I get more seeds and stuff, I'm planting in the native, and hopefully that will take over as ground cover, because I have yarrow in there, which is a lovely ground cover. and the Knick growing in there too, which will cover the ground. So it's just the approach and the type of environment that you have for and choosing the right plants for that environment. Don't put a plant that wants to be in the sun in an area that. And then I have a lot of little sedges that are growing in my front as well, which is a native. It's not a grass, but it looks like grass.
Hmm.
And if you're going to go lawn, that's what your lawn should be, is sedge. And you really don't have to mow it because they only get to a certain height anyways.
Right. It's like a short grass that's, yeah.
Yes, yeah.
Most people probably wouldn't even be able to tell the difference in
No,
some
I
ways,
know.
right? Yeah, that's interesting. We got an email from Diane who writes, I'm interested in getting rid of my lawn for native plants and food. I'm a little worried about digging up the yard because I have underground sprinklers and not sure where the pipes are. Do you have any suggestions? Candace, I'm wondering if you've run into anything like that, you don't really know what's under there. So what would you maybe say to Diane?
I guess I would say if you have the blueprints or some kind of plan from when the sprinklers were installed. But we did do this to a yard that had underground sprinklers, and they're fairly logically placed. The pipes should generally be kind of in a straight line from wherever your water source is. So I would say dig carefully and cautiously if you don't have those plans. But as long as you have kind of a general idea of where those sprinklers are, you can maybe dig around with a shovel first. And that being said, if you're just taking your sod up, your pipes should be deeper than how much you'd be digging. And you could also do a more passive method of just laying a heavy tarp over the area that you want to turn into a garden. Just lay it over that area for a couple months at least, maybe the whole summer and the whole winter, and that will kill your grass in a really passive way, and then you could just kind of dig directly into that.
Oh, yeah, that's a good idea. Sandra, we've talked primarily about our yards with you, but I know that you've got a connection to Saskatchewan. And, when we talk about native plants, I was thinking about how Meewasin will be doing these pollinator walks in the days and weeks ahead, which gives people a chance to be out on the native prairie and spot things and actually learn about what they are. And so I'm just wondering, Sandra, if you want to bring anything into the conversation about some of the work that you do outside of your yard and how that might help us appreciate, what it is that we have here.
Yes, like I said, I having all these plants and mine's been doing very well. I collect my seeds and I make sure that I get back out in wild spaces, and I play seed fairy in some of my favorite wild places. Saskatoon, at one when they get a lot of my seeds basically. And the front of the building when we did renos was very weedy. And so what we did do is we've tarped it for a year to smother the weeds that are there. Actually, this is our second year of doing it because the first year they put down clear plastic and it kind of acted like a greenhouse. But maybe we germinated a bunch of seeds and now we're actually smothering. So and we're going to rototill it and we're going to plant it with native plants as much as possible. And we're going to be blowing native seeds into the valley instead of weed seeds is our goal. But yeah, it's such a large area and we don't want to use chemicals to get rid of things and stuff. So the tarp idea works quite well for burning off grasses and those kind of things. But yes, if you get into having native plants, if you can share with your seeds with other people and go play seed fairy in because there's this one area where I walk my dog on a regular basis, and there used to be a bunch of wild onions, and they started dwindling because people were walking so much there. So I started making sure my wild onion seeds, and I've planted breadroot seeds out there, and a lot of other Glardia and a few other things, just to make sure that they pop up again. So give back where you can.
What advice do you have for people, though, to make sure that they're spreading the right stuff and to avoid buying things that are actually invasive? What's your advice on that?
Yeah. I can do it because I do know which what. Um, um, so yeah, you make sure that you do have the native version. Because for example, if you have bergamot in your yard, if it's a red flower, then that's a European bergamot. It's not the native version of bergamot. Ours is a purple flower. If you have yarrow that has a pink flower on it, again, that's
Yeah.
not the native version. And so you want the white flower on it. And trying to talk your greenhouse local greenhouses into selling these kind of things, and because that's one of the things I do on a regular basis whenever I am in a greenhouse is, if you start selling more native plants, you might get a little more business. And
And the three that
one of my big
I want to reiterate for people: Blazing Star, Prairie Original, and there was a third that you mentioned,
the
Sandra.
Prairie Boutique,
Prairie Boutique.
and there's Accolades, and yeah, I think that's all of them.
Yeah.
Accolades, Prairie Original, Blazing Star, and Prairie Boutique.
Okay.
Prairie Boutique's out of Saskatoon too.
I want to give you each just 30 seconds to make your final pitch to people about why they should think about even just doing a small little patch, something a little bit different. Candace?
Lots of pressure. I think honestly, it adds a lot of interest to your yard, and growing your own food or turning your yard into something other than grass that is interesting and beautiful, and adds biodiversity. It's really rewarding. So I think even just for that and the community building aspect of, it connects you with your neighbors and your community, I think are all kind of cherries on top of getting to grow your own food in your own yard.
Prairie cherry on top. How about that?
Prairie cherry on top, exactly.
Sandra, I'll give you the last few seconds here. What would you say to people who are thinking about this?
Again, it's insects, and there was a little girl that lived next door. She's moved on, but she used to pop through the front boulevard all of the time along the rocks, looking at all the insects. And when you see that and getting children interested in nature is another gift, I think, beyond just the gift to biodiversity, and hopefully educate more people about doing something different.
This has
It's
been
okay to be different.
It's okay to be different. Oh, yes. It has been awesome talking to both of you today, and our first guest, too. What a lovely show. So, Candace, thank you.
Thanks for having me.
And Sandra, thanks to you, too.
Thanks for having me as well. It was great.
Sandra Walker is a member of Wild About Saskatoon and the author of Path to Wild Food. Candace Benson is one half of the business City Street Farms Regina. She turns people's front yards into veggie and flower beds. You'll be able to find her at the Regina Farmers Market on Wednesdays.